Hey, podcasters, long time no talk. And that is absolutely my fault for dropping the ball. I had some big ideas for April, and I just completely derailed. I wanted to talk about Earth Month, which was April, connect it with some things in Women's Month, which was in March. I might still do an episode soon about that, or I'm just going to save it for next year. But I had some ideas laid out, some parts of the episodes all written out, and I'm sorry. Without giving excuses, I'm sorry. I dropped the ball. Anyway, I'm going to make up for that bit with this episode and talk to you about, you guessed it, climate change and conservation in one episode. Thank you very much. I wanted to highlight some recent articles and published research that has come out in the last month or two. Some of these are going to be some very touchy subjects. They're very hot topics right now. And some of them, I imagine, have probably completely been swept under the radar for a lot of people. Hey, that's cool. You might learn something new, or you might have a different viewpoint of something that you've seen somebody else talk about. I do have to give a disclosure that if animal cruelty is hard for you, you may want to skip this first topic, just the first couple minutes. It won't be graphic or anything, but it does involve my favorite animal under some very unfortunate circumstances. Doesn't begin to cover it, but my favorite animal is a wolf, as you can imagine. So, without further ado, let's go to the first topic. And like I said, it won't be graphic. In recent weeks, many news articles have come out about an event that happened at the tail end of February 29th, because yay, leap years, we got an extra day. A sad excuse of a man ran a wolf down on his snowmobile, injuring it. He then taped its mouth shut, paraded it around at a bar while it suffered for hours, and then took it out back and shot it to death. And that's going to be the end of the graphicness, because I don't want to go into detail. There are really horrific videos and photos out there if you are morbidly curious, but I can't go near it. That's animal cruelty, no matter which way you split it. You wouldn't do that to a pet, would you? No, absolutely not. So why would you do it to a wild animal? Because it's an apex predator and you're a hunter who has no respect for the creatures that you are hunting? It's vile, and it completely shows any lack of humanity. So anyway, that's the end of the graphic part. If you're still listening, what has since come from this is a number of lawsuits and protests. The man who did this was only given a $250 fine, and that's it. Basically a slap on the wrist and a pat on the back. And on top of that, the fine wasn't even for the torture and murder of the wolf. It was just for possessing a live wolf. So it wasn't even for the act of cruelty. It's just for having it. I might have failed to say this, but this happened in Wyoming. Animal rights and conservation groups are now suing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife for their lack of action on this. The groups that are suing argue that the state of Wyoming has no interest in protecting wolves, which were removed from protection previously. I think it was in 2021 from the Rockies. Just kind of ironic considering it's like 95% of Yellowstone is in Wyoming, and there was such a huge push for reintroduction of wolves to balance the ecosystem. 85% of Wyoming is considered a predator zone, which is something new that I learned about. It's where no permit is needed, and you can hunt any time of the year. No restriction, you can shoot on site. And that's something that U.S. Fish and Wildlife allowed as an acceptable plan for population management. So I'm not entirely sure how you're going to have population management when you don't have to have licenses or anything that stops people from shooting every single wolf that they see. And then we're just back at square one, right? Also worth noting, the Wyoming Fish and Wildlife were very tight-lipped about this whole incident, even canceling conferences. And it took some journalists digging, like really digging, and putting the nitty-gritty details out for the public. They're the ones who like really broke the story. They somehow got their hands on the photos and footage of what took place at the bar before and after and everything. And also, something worth noting is that the only reason this guy was caught is because someone anonymously turned him over to authorities for what he did. Anyway, while some clearly support the guy who tortured and killed the wolf, like his family who's out there just like making fun of the whole event and everything, there's also hunter groups They're very actively speaking out, saying what he did was completely unacceptable, that no hunters should ever do anything like that, and hunters need to have respect for what they are doing. They're taking a life and they need to have respect for that, which, okay, sure. And since this incident, there has been a stronger push against the practice of running down animals via snowmobiles, essentially chasing them until they're too exhausted to keep going. And so far, attempts to end this practice have completely been shot down. There's plenty of wildlife groups out there that you can follow on whatever social media you're on. They're keeping tabs on the development of this incident. They're giving every new thing that's happening just a play-by-play. I am seeing almost daily new updates. Like I said, it happened at the end of February, but the story didn't really come out until April of what happened. So it's an ongoing thing. And obviously, wolves have been a hot topic in the north and the west, northwest, and the United States for many years, many years. All right, now to get away from the torturing of an animal, but onto another conservation topic. And it's a topic that's been hot and getting hotter, like our climate. Sorry, okay. That was a bad dad joke. Anyway, so this topic has to do with dams, salmon, and orcas. And it's a really very complex topic and perhaps should be its own episode, which I think I will actually do its own episode. Just, it's going to take a lot to compile every argument going for it. But anyway, this topic is really hot in the Pacific Northwest since we love our resident orcas, and we want to protect the salmon they eat. And we can use a lot of hydroelectricity. I mean, hell, okay, 44% of my electricity that I use comes from hydro, which, sidebar, you can go to the EPA's power profiler and you just punch in your zip code or your address, whatever, and it will tell you all the composition of where your power comes from. Is it electric? Is it gas? Is it coal? Go on, so on and so forth. But the 44% is the majority of mine, which is hydro, which is really cool. And like I said, so back to the topic. It's a very complex topic, and I'm just going to give the gist of what's happening and be as unbiased as possible while being a Washingtonian resident who really loves her orcas. So the proposal put forth is to remove 4 dams on the Snake River, which leads into the Columbia River, and the Columbia drains into the ocean. You might know the Columbia as that big old river that separates Washington and Oregon. It's cold and it's huge. It's pretty awesome, actually. So these dams provide irrigation and electricity for the surrounding areas, but they also have contributed to the decline and near extinction of 13 species of salmon and steelhead. While electricity is good, extinction of species is bad, right? And we kind of want to not contribute to that as humans, considering how much we have contributed. So anyway, the nonprofit organization Earth Justice, which you may or may not have heard of, and with the support of the Nez Perce tribe here, sued the federal government in 2021 over its dam operations on the Snake River, with respect to their effect on those mentioned fish that I talked about, and how it impacts our beloved orcas who rely on the salmon for food. Also worth mentioning, because I see it often in comment sections, wherever, and people asking, well, why don't the orcas just feed on something else? I see orcas eating seals and da-da-da. Yeah, there's different orcas that have different diets, and our resident orcas here feed almost exclusively on salmon. And as the salmon population declines, that's less for them. So we want to make sure that they are getting their bellies full. And you might have seen over the last few years that the pods here have had some trouble bearing young. The dams, coupled with the rising temperatures, which obviously has been happening, and salmon are very sensitive to them, and the overfishing that has contributed to the loss of population. Among the commitments proposed by federal officials in the draft from Earth Justice and their supporters, more than $1 billion in investments to develop alternative sources of renewable energy in the Columbia Basin, particularly for tribal communities, as well as investments in fish passage improvements. Kind of an interesting thing to talk about. Habitat restoration and hatcheries are all part of this draft put forward on how to solve this problem. The push to remove the dams isn't just removal, but it's also habitat restoration for the Columbia River Basin. And proponents who are pushy for this used a NOAA, which is the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, a study where NOAA said that the removal of the dams can benefit the basin. So they're using this study from a government entity to bolster the claim to remove the dams. The other side of the argument, those who are against the removal of the dams, argue there is too much vagueness in this 30-something long page report that was put forth about where new sources of power are going to come from once the dams are gone and we don't have that hydroelectricity anymore. There's also the power companies, and there's a lot of power companies who are upset that they haven't been part of the negotiations. But Elizabeth Manning from Earth Justice said it's possible to come to a comprehensive solution to make sure power isn't lost and that renewables of some, mind you, I haven't read this big ass report, but she advocates that renewables can be put in place to help mitigate the loss of hydroelectricity and save the fish species, while rebuilding the area. Also worth mentioning, this region, mid-south-ish area of Washington, there is so many wind turbines. I'm not entirely sure about, I haven't seen any solar farms or anything like that, but wind turbines just scatter all along the Columbia Basin. So I'm going to guess, without having reading, take this with a grain of salt, that they're going to want to push that more. Anyway, so that's just a snippet of something that's been going on for quite a few years now, and it's getting more heated and more heated. And shifting direction in climate news, the other half of this podcast, Monmouth University released an updated poll about climate change concerns. And if you haven't heard of them, they're an institute that polls the public to monitor current opinions, and they actually rank 5th as the most trusted for accuracy and transparency out of over 500 of these types of organizations. So it's not too shabby, really. Anyway, so this poll has been continually updated for the last decade, and recently they released an update on people in the US who view climate change as a very serious problem, quote, and state that it's fallen below 50%. But what I found interesting is that young people between 18 and 34 dropped in their percentage of urgency by 17 points, but it's still 66% of that age group believe that it's a serious problem. So it's still high. The poll did have some other heavy hitters in the topics like the economy, abortion, immigration, which are all really hot topics right now, especially considering the election cycle. So maybe, I'm just projecting because it's a poll, so people can't give feedback around why they chose the way they did. But I'm going to say perhaps stacked against those other topics, it feels less urgent than everything else that's happening right now. The poll also showed a near identical percentage of people who thought climate change is caused more by human impact versus those who thought it's natural and human caused. That's not bad. I will take it. I'll take it. There was also a drop in support for government action on climate change. I could see a drop in government support being from the historical inaction by the government. So why? Or, again, focusing on other issues at hand. Conversely, there's a slight uptick in people believing climate change isn't an issue at all. So, do with that what you will. Anyway, that's just some numbers for you on people's opinions in the United States on climate change and its urgency, and the poll results. If you want to look at more of the numbers, I'm going to put links for this on the YouTube. Anyway, it's a very short little snippet, but I like being the math person that I am. I can appreciate a poll and the statistics coming out of it. Oh, also, I think it was polled out of 800 people. So, a little bit of nerd thing here for you. They take a sample, and then they broadcast the results of that sample to the entire population. Bada bing, bada boom. All right, to deviate a bit from some hard numbers and further into climate news on the science front. The Arctic continues to warm, and that is a problem. Obviously. Remember a few years back, I think it was like 2015, and there was a heat wave that thawed out some of the Siberian permafrost. And when it did, there were animal carcasses that were infected with anthrax, and it released spores, which then killed a bunch of reindeer herds, and a bunch of people got sick. I think 1 or 2 people died. Now think about this other scenario of the Arctic warming. Inuit villages are sinking, or in some instances, falling into sinkholes thanks to the permafrost thawing underneath their homes, which their homes are built on. Yeah, kind of a problem, right? This topic it's actually really cool. It's about these scientists that do these really cool experiments, and without me just totally spoiling everything, let's get to it. So, the scientists went to the tundra and performed an array of experiments where they set up these little mini greenhouses in different regions, like little mini ones. So they set them up in different regions, and it was to control for the rise in air and soil temperature. And they set it so that it rose from 0.4 to 1.6 degrees Celsius. And for people who refuse to switch to the metric system, that is 0.72 to 2.52 Fahrenheit. So raising the temp allowed them to see how the plants and the microbes in the little greenhouses reacted to that increase in the soil and the air temperature. Specifically, how their respiration rate was. Now, respiration is just like humans. Plants respire or breathe and release carbon dioxide just like we do. But what scientists found is that the little biome inhabitants were releasing an average of a 30% increase in CO2 by just a fraction of a degree to a couple of degrees, depending which metric or not metric that you're using. It really wasn't that big of a jump, with a 30% increase in CO2. And on top of that, that was more than the researchers even predicted. It's a small temperature increase, and oh my gosh, we are already seeing this, we are already seeing these things. Anyway, so they noted that different soil compositions had an impact on the amount of respiration happening in their little biomes. Like the soil containing less nitrogen actually increased the respiration rate. The setup for the experiment is good to try different areas. If you hold your arms out and link them together and make a circle with your arms, if your arms are a hula hoop, that's about how big the tiny little greenhouses were that they were plopping down in different areas. So the setup for the experiment is good, allows them to try this in a bunch of different areas. The one drawback that was noted, though, is they aren't able to separate how much respiration came from the microbes in the ground versus the plants themselves. Also worth mentioning that the plants and the microbes have kind of a symbiotic relationship where they feed each other. It's kind of interesting to think about. It's worth mentioning that as someone who does data science for a living, and this will apply to the next thing I'm going to say about the experiment, but it's easier to predict what is going to happen on shorter time scales versus longer ones. The longer the time scale gets, the wider the error bars around what it is you're measuring become. So as they're looking at how far in time it's going to be for the temperature to rise, how far in the future it's going to be for the plants and the microbes, and there's a bunch of other parts to this as well. What is it going to look like for them? Is it a 30% increase in CO2 release? Is that what's going to happen? Will it be more? Will it be less? What scientists noted was that after about 18 years, microbes release less CO2 than the shorter time scale earlier in the experiment. So that's good. But as for long-term trends, they don't really know if the tundra is going to be a carbon sink where carbon is stored, because currently the microbes and the plants just store that carbon down underground, or if, as things get warming, if it's going to be a release. And then there's also the problem that if releasing overcomes how much is being stored, then you get a feedback loop. Not a great thing. It's pretty dang neat to be able to create these tiny little biomes and be able to measure what is happening within them and use that to predict something bigger. Sort of like how polls work, taking a sample and broadcasting to a larger population. Continuing on the trend of heating up. Trend, get it? Because it's warming up, which is a trend, and it's heating, and okay. Bad math jokes. Anyway, you're welcome. On to the ocean, what warming means for their ecosystems. So there was a little study that came out recently. NOAA and OSU, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and Oregon State University. They released a new study about heat waves' impact on the ecosystem of the North California Current. The Northern Current reaches from Vancouver Island, British Columbia, down to Cape Mendocino, California. I'm sorry, I'm totally going to botch that. I've never been there. I'm sorry. So the stretch of the northern part of the current, it's a region that's home to fisheries and salmon, that precious salmon that we mentioned in the previous little news segment. So in recent years, or at least since 2013, there's been unusual extended periods of warming in the waters, which has affected the ecosystems, as you can imagine. Salmon, again, are sensitive to temperatures above 64, and it can be lethal for them if the waters get above 70. The temperature anomalies have led to mass die-off events and changes to the abundance and the distribution of species. Some species grow in numbers where others die off. Like, you might have remembered there was a few years where there were mass die-offs of jellyfish on the west coast because of what they called the blob, the heat blob that was in the ocean. The researchers did a couple different types of models. They did something called a predator-prey model, which describes the interaction of the prey consumption rate by the predator being proportional to the abundance of prey. And if that was confusing, the simple way is the more prey, the more that can be consumed, vice versa. The other model is a causal effect model, and that's something I've done a number of times, and it looks at the ecosystem before and after a heat wave. This is a type of model I've done, but in simple terms, it's going to look a little bit something like this. We have the model of how an ecosystem functions before the heat wave event. Over time, a heat wave happens and that model changes. So we use the data before the heat wave and forecast it forward as if the heat wave never happened, meaning to predict what the model would still look like over time. Which then, that prediction can be compared to the data after the heat wave happens. We can compare the two and see if there's a difference in, say, marine populations or ocean temperatures, that sort of thing. That lets us know if this event had an effect. This research paper looked at food webs with the interaction and feeding of the northern current. So the model showed that the lower levels of the oceanic food web, think like tiny little plankton and things, were the greatest to be affected by heat waves. But that there was a large influx of an organism called the pyrosomes. They're like, how do I describe it? If you've seen a picture, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. They look like these kind of elongated gelatinous things. And they're actually built up of even smaller organisms, like this big mass. They're kind of like a transparent squishy tube. Anyway, okay. So the influx that happened then had an effect because they consumed more resources. The pyrosomes did. That would have been available to other sea critters that are on that lower food chain. Other oceanic life, like sardines, consumed less during the heat wave versus before, which led to smaller populations of them. Then that leads to less for the next level of predators to feed on, and so on, and the ripple effect, if you will. The interesting thing to note is that although the pyrosomes population increased, they weren't fed upon by the upper predators. You'd think like, oh, there's a bunch more of them, that means more food. Yeah, no. Apparently they're not very digestible. They're avoided, so there's just a bunch of gelatinous blobs. So because they weren't being eaten, this means that they consumed more on that lower level, giving away to that ripple effect where they took more food that other species would have wanted. There's a bunch of intricacies in the ecosystem, and despite some negative effects, the positive effects appeared to give an overall stable system. Basically, life finds a way, in the words of a great science fiction character. And so as heat waves continue to happen for extended periods of time, which is kind of our trend now, the future give and take model, the predator-prey model, it's uncertain how the ecosystem will fare in the long term. Okay, this one's a little bit shorter of a topic for you. It's more on the sustainable route of things. There's been some headlines floating around for the last couple months that California is running 100% on renewables, which is awesome. But nearly every headline I've seen is misleading in what's happening. And we know how many people just look at a headline and don't actually read the article. They did, in fact, run on renewables for a certain amount of time, for a number of hours each day. It varied from, I think it was 15 minutes to 6 hours a day, but it was for like almost 30-something consecutive days, which was different than before. They've run on renewables before, but not for that many days in a row. The power grid was supplied with solar, wind, hydropower, geothermal, and battery storage. And I know someone out there is going to be like, wind turbines, bad, rah. Yeah, don't worry. I got an episode coming out just for you. We're going to talk all about turbines, your precious little turbines. Don't worry about it. Although there's periods of time that are running purely on renewables, natural gas is still being used as a backup while this is all happening. And they're still exporting the power from that natural gas outside of the state. So although they might be running the state themselves on purely renewable, they're still using that gas at the same time, but just using it outside the state. They have set a goal, California has, to be 100% renewable by 2045. And right now, they are supposed to hit that goal around 2030, 2035. They're going to be way ahead of time, which is cool. It's cool. Power to you if you can make it work. All the power to you. Get it? Power? I am full of puns. I hope you appreciate this. All right, that was our first news roundup episode. Covered stuff in conservation, covered some climate change topics, and bridged a little bit into sustainability, which involves all of the above. To end the episode, though, I just want to mention that wildfire season has already started, especially for Canada, where thousands of acres are burning and people are being asked to evacuate in areas. Here in Washington, we've already had fires popping up as well. Not as bad as Canada right now, but we are also severely under our normal for snowpack, which tends to mean a harsher summer, but we'll see what happens here too. Cheers to living in the Fire Nation. And on a side note, right now one of my favorite groups, the Voyager Wolf Project, which is based out of Minnesota, has a fundraising campaign to continue their efforts tracking and working with ranchers for sustainable wolf management. And it's actually really, really successful what they do. You should definitely check out their socials and see the testimonials and everything that they're doing. They have really awesome videos of wolves up there. They do a lot of outreach. I'm not sponsored or anything like that. I just really freaking love them and want to support them while this fundraising campaign is going. If you ever see any article or a statistic floating around on socials, as they do in meme format without context, and you want me to look into it, you can absolutely shoot me a link on YouTube. Just pick a comment section, throw it on there. I'll figure it out. All of the topics that I've talked about, I will post a few of the articles, backing them up with more context in the description of this episode. So I hope you learned something about the current news stories floating around, and until next time, enjoy the fresh air. Think about Earth.